Others cracked into syllables like broken bread. She named us in those broken syllables. Tyne came to me with hands raw from worry. He has the practical mind of a man who has put plates together since boyhood. He treats names as types, as forms that can be set and reset. We can make them false accounts, he said, pacing around the bare table in the back, where we had once folded leaflets like prayers. We can write confessions that contradict what they coaxed from her. If we can put into the record a note of misdirection and administrative error, a duplicate, then perhaps the tribunal will have to pause. Their certainty depends upon smooth columns. I have always admired Tyne's metaphors because they convert the abstract terror into machinery I can imagine, press, ink, plate. But his plan was not merely a suggestion for a forgery, it was a moral equation that we could not solve on paper. To create a false document that would protect one is to fabricate evidence that might later be used against another. And yet, what is the alternative when the ledger itself is a shaper of destinies? Tyne put his palms on the table and looked at me with what I suppose are called the eyes of a desperate man. Do we risk the forgery and hope for chaos enough to save them, or do we sit and watch names be read aloud and bodies fall in order? Father Benot's counsel was slower. He folded his hands as if the question were a sacrament. There is a difference between truth and testimony, he said at last. A testimony may be true in its motive and false in its detail. The city thinks itself a sum of names. We must teach it that a ledger can be countermarched by conscience. It is not only the question of what we do next that pressed me, but what we already had done. Each falsification we had printed, each margin we had annotated, had been an incision. They had saved some and sent others to the scaffold. And now a young woman, who had been suit to our lamp, made her way through the tribunal's economy of terror and came back with bleeding hands full of names. The ledger had eaten into our lives and found food. One night, while the rain rubbed the window panes of the shop with tiny palms, I walked the route Lucy had once walked between hideaways. I moved like someone taking inventory, the laundress door where Hortense blackened a hand with gossip, the bakery where the apprentice boy sold stale bread for credit, a lamppost under which Bastien had left a folded note like a secret bird. Places hold the memory of hands. The city is a palimpsest of deliverances. When a place knows it will be called, it arranges itself to answer. The question of Lucy's confession was not only material but metaphysical. She had given up names, some true, some collated from rumor. I had to follow the ledger's logic and see what it would claim to own. It claimed the right to make a sequence of deaths, and not only deaths but the sequence's meaning. If a man was named as a conspirator, then to die was, in the city's ledger, to be proven so. The guillotine confirmed the prosaic truth of the page. This is the administration's genius. It binds meaning to the noise of the crowd. We took what we could from Father Benot's quiet, a scrap of linen, a bowl of warmed water, some herbs to lay upon Lucy's skin to soothe it. He knelt and talked to her in a voice that taught her to inhale again, like someone instructing a child to play the recorder. Names can be like weather, he said to her, they pass. But if you teach the city to read winds, if you show that lists are made by hands, then you change how they speak of fate. Lucy wept and then did not weep. Her face hardened with the peculiar, tragic education of those who have had the marrow of their life counted by strangers. They ask me about everyone, she whispered once to me, the sound of a bell scraped by rust. They made me list the names in order. I tried to say only the ones I knew, that Tyne left plates in his chimney, that Bastien took leaflets to the market, but they pressed me, and I told about people I had not seen in weeks, things I had heard in taverns, rumors that seemed true when they asked them like questions. You told the truth as you were given it, I said. The sentence felt like a poor salve. It's not your fault when names are treated like evidence of sin. She looked at me then with a thing like adult fatigue. Who else would do it? She asked. When I said a name in the room, They wrote it and read it like a psalm. I thought they might spare the people I loved if they had proof that the book was true. Proof the ledger wants only to be believed. It takes the reasonable human desire for certainty and turns it into a bedrock of policy. When a ledger is believed, it ceases to be a record and becomes a law. Lucy's words were now lodged in its spine. Tyne worked until the big hours, oil black beneath his nails and his breath loud in the cold air. He struck the type like one who knows that each letter might be someone's fate. I watched him set the bodies of words into the chase, and I thought of the hands that would come after, of bureaucrats with neat pens, of clerks who would take our forgery into their accounting and, we hoped, misfile it or misread it so that the city would be obliged to pause. We drafted a confession that was ridiculous upon inspection, a document that would implicate a fictive committee whose name was a thin joke where none would look for a joke. It was an act of legal vandalism to introduce into the tribunal's record an impossible mouthful that would force them to ask in public how proof could be so easily assembled. It would require Tyne to risk his plates and his place. It would require the courier network to carry falsified evidence into the hands of clerks who might, if the script were right, set it into the official train. If they took the bait, the tribunal would be obliged to investigate a phantom and, in doing so, give the city time to consider that names might be manufactured. We knew, as any who have worked presses know, that forgery is not merely a moral transgression but a technical gamble. Type wears, ink dries differently. Even the scent of paper can betray a decade. Tyne cursed under his breath when a line would not sit right. His jaw made a small animal sound that I had heard only once before, when he had set the face of a tribute page, and we had both known a man's life would rest on one letter. "We are making a living thing," he said. "Once it's born, it will have a life we cannot entirely predict." Father Binoti folded his hands and blessed the paper in his small, idiosyncratic way. "We cannot sanctify deceit," he told me, "but perhaps we can consecrate a necessary lie when the ledger itself is a sacrilege." That night, while Tyne printed and the city slept under the thin cold, I returned to Lucy's cell. She had not asked for me. She had not begged. She had learned to be silent in the small hours, where silence is its own protection. But when she saw the forged sheet, which Tyne had left folded in its false boasts, she took it like a child taking a candle. She read it twice, and then put it back on the table, as if setting down a hot iron. Her fingers trembled in a way that made the paper flutter like a bird. "Will it help?" she asked. I had no satisfactory answer. The shop runs on small, compound interests, a joke here, a falsified confession there, a priest's murmur. Some of these things buy time. Other things buy only a suppressed scream. I put my hand over hers. "We will try," I said. "We will be crafty. We will be cruel to the ledger." There is a weight to this kind of resolve. It feels like a ledger itself. One adds choices and watches a balance fall toward a terrible sum. We do not act in the wide glare of philosophy, but in the small arithmetic of consequence. Between Lucy's confession and Tyne's forgery is a brittle possibility. Perhaps the city can be made to stumble. Perhaps a clerk will misfile. Perhaps a commissaire will have to explain a contradiction to a crowd that had come to prefer explanations in the shape of orders. Or perhaps we will simply add to the city's account another name, another reason for a head to be set upon a block. When I left the cell that night, the rain had stopped and the city exhaled a damp breath. The lamps in the square made small islands on the water of the cobbles. In the distance, the tribunal's roof cut the sky like a ruled line. I walked back through the lane with the forged paper pressed like a liturgy to my breast. I thought of my father and the debts that had sent me from a provincial house to the cramped eaves of this shop. I thought of my brother and the reasons he had fled. I thought of the simple arithmetic we had been taught by books, that to know is to be obliged. The ledger had taught us a similar lesson by unkindness, that to be known is to be bound. At the counter I opened the till and took out the small, dull coin that Tyne had given me for the plates we had burned the week before. I laid it on the wood like an offering, and for the first time in my life, felt the weight of a different accounting. The shop is a place where things are shelved and given names. Tonight it would be a place where we shelved a lie purposely. The choice felt less like courage than the subtraction from fear. We had no illusions. The forged sheet might become a new instrument for them. It might be found and used to argue that a counter-revolution existed after all. But perhaps it could also be a mirror they would be obliged to consider. In the morning, Jean Morel returned to tell us that Lucy had been moved to another ward, that some of the names she had given had already led to arrests, that the tribunal's machinery was humming with renewed efficiency. He did not dwell on the faces of those taken. He told us instead that there had been confusion in the clerk's office that afternoon, an administrative error. His voice broke, and for a heartbeat he looked like a man who had chosen mercy. I could not ask more. The ledger continued to eat. Its appetite was less monstrous than banal. It wanted a record, a column, a signature. Against it we set our hands, a priest's murmuring, a printer's night, a girl's frightened honesty. We had done all that could be done with tools at hand, and I felt, finally, the certain wrongness of some of our acts. Tyne's plates glinted in the chimney like a small, guilty votive. Father Benotit's bowl at the chapel needed a new cloth. Lucy's wrists would bear the marks for some time, and yet the ledger had been punctured, if ever so slightly. When I turned the key in the shop's door that night, I heard the city's distant discord. Someone singing a revolutionary chant, a cart clattering, the guillotine's wooden cleats striking like a punctuation. I lay awake with the folded forged sheet beneath my pillow and the small, terrible fact of Lucy's confession like a grain beneath my tongue. The decision we had made, Tyne's plan, Father Benotit's blessing, would either slow the ledger's appetite or add to its feast. I did not think I could prevent the ledger from taking more names. I only hoped, in the way one hopes with hands tied, that the names it took next would be chosen with some care. Outside in the dark, the city arranged itself as a ledger does, line upon line, name upon name, each item waiting for the clerk to affix meaning. Inside, in the small room, we prepared the next counter-entry. The balance would be determined not by an arithmetic of reason, but by the happenstances of courage and fear. Lucy had learned, in the chamber where the quill scratched, that names can be turned into rope as easily as they can be turned into keys. We had learned in our own small ways that knowledge is a thing whose weight can break a neck. I slept fitfully, and in the morning I woke with the sensation that the bookshop itself had grown wary. The shelves seemed to lean inward, as if listening. I dressed, tied my scarf, and went to the back room where Tyne's plate lay waiting, black as a wound. Outside, the day had brightened in a thin, brittle way. I took up the forged confession and, like a woman who has accepted an impossible arithmetic, carried it between my palms. The ledger and the counter-ledger would meet sooner than later. Their collision would be noisy, public, and perhaps decisive. I did not know then whether the result would be triumph or ruin. Only that a decision had been made, and that the city would be obliged to reckon with it. The doorbell tinkled. It was a small sound, but in the hours we had kept ourselves it was enough to make me start. Someone had come sooner than I expected. I folded the paper and slid it into the hollow of a book. Where else does one hide the truth but in the margins of other truths? And went to open the shop, aware that the day's accounts had already begun, that another entry would be made, and that the ledger was listening. I found my name as one finds a bruise on a familiar arm, unmistakable, intimate, and impossible to ignore. There are different sorts of recognition: the sudden, kindling recognition of a friend in a crowd, the slow, sifting recognition of a book you have loved and forgotten, but the kind that came when I lifted the folded sheet was of a more mathematical cruelty. The ledger did not shout, it arranged, names in a column, trade, date. In the ledger's economy there was no room for context, only coordinates. I read Marie Lemaire Libre 15 Thermidor. The ink lay flat, black and obedient. It felt less like a prophecy and more like an invoice for a future to be paid. I had handled the manuscript enough, by then, to know the rhythm of its hand. There was that economy of stroke, a clerk's reverence for space, a man who never wasted a flourish. The letters, small and efficient, did not need anyone to explain them. They explained themselves. For months I had watched the ledger make its little deaths, naming one acquaintance, and then another, and I had learned that the ledger's efficacy depended on its apparent immutability. People submitted to lists as to weather. You do not ask a storm to change its mind. You take shelter. But this was different. My name, bracketed in the ledger as if by the margin of a census, turned weather into address. It turned a public instrument into a private letter. I could feel in my fingers the old habit of counting words as keys. A name could open a drawer or close a neck. I folded the page back along its crease with a care that felt absurdly domestic. The shop was as it ever was, wood-scented shelves, trunks with false bottoms that hummed like old teeth, the single window that never let in much light. Outside, the street kept the mutter of its business, a cart, a woman calling her laundry, the constant rattle at windows from where people counted the day's gossip. Inside, the air tasted of glue. I sat then, with the ledger between my palms, and tried to think as if I were counting type rather than fearing life. I made a list on a scrap of paper, the sort of inventory a bookseller takes for calm options. Do nothing, falsify, expose the mechanism. The first was abdication. The second, sabotage. The third, perhaps the most dangerous of all, because it put the ledger's authority on trial. If the ledger can be shown to be a ledger's work, the tribunal's story might unravel. If the ledger is the story, a revelation might be read as treason. I folded my scrap and put it beneath the ledger, as if by layering pages one could make a weight. I did not tell Tyne at once. He had been careful and scared for weeks. His hands, which I have seen press and then bruise type, would not do well with the terror of knowing that the press might soon print my name. I chose instead to walk to the chapel, more to test the world than to seek counsel. The walk was short, but it compressed like a bellows. Each footfall measured time in the way a bow measures the length of a string. The city had grown thin with fear. Where once there was talk and argument, there was now an economy of appointments. People met to exchange lists rather than news. Father Benot met me below the chapel with the lamps on low. He had the habit, to which I had become accustomed, of treating secrets like books in need of cataloguing, as if a sin could be bested by accurate shelf marks. He read the ledger with the deliberateness of a man who had been taught to see guilt in small print. They catalogue us as only administrators can, he said, tapping a finger against a name as if the epidermis of the paper were a map. They turn the city into a ledger because ledgers are comfortable. You can add and subtract, and the sums make people feel as if order is possible. His voice was not small, and yet it was not the voice of scandal. It was the voice that tells you what a thing is in order that you can decide how to act. My name is in it, I said. The syllables seemed to be things I could count. 2 consonants, 3 vowels, a double consonant in Lemaire, as if to emphasize the doubling of the act itself. He looked at me as a man looks at another who has been given a weight. It is not the ledger that kills, he said after a while. It is the people who read it and make their verdicts. The ledger is paper. Paper can be argued with. The question is, do you go to them with the paper, or do you try to make them doubt the paper? I found that description intolerable in its practicality. The ledger was not a mere text, it was an apparatus. The tribunal read names in ceremonial voice. The executioner took them down in a register. Clerks transferred them from one list to another until a life had been processed into a date. To hold the ledger's page between my fingers was to hold one link of that machine. If I could show that the machine was human-made annotated, collated, bribed, coursed, then perhaps the machine would appear fallible. Father Bino T had his methods. He had a clandestine archive beneath his chapel, a place of old breviaries and marginal notes where people left pieces of themselves when the world outside demanded only official narratives. He suggested what priests often suggest in times of crisis, a retreat into small truth. "We catalogue history differently down here," he said, unlocking a wooden chest that smelled of mildew and lavender. "A ledger is only a ledger until someone annotates it. Add the margins, add the footnotes, and you change its sense. You cannot change the hand that wrote the name," he added quickly, as if to forestall a hopelessness. "But you can show the hand that placed it in your life. Show the ledger is not a God's decree, but a human act, that men with desks made choices, names stop being fate when we show their origin." I nodded because his words were exact, and because in the chapel's low light they sounded like a plan. I also saw, with the terrible clarity of people who count risks as if on scales, that such revelation was itself dangerous. To reveal was to demand public reasoning. Public reasoning could result in a further tightening of power. The tribunal might prefer, in its panic, to more efficiently execute any opponent who challenged its mechanisms. It was Tien who offered the more immediate, more familiar option: make a copy that would rearrange the ledger's next line. We had already made false lists small and cautious, like contraband pastries wrapped to look like bread. Tien had always equated the press with salvation or sin depending on which side of the day he woke on. Now he proposed a forgery so precise that it would have to be read as authentic by any clerk who cared only for order. "I can make them believe the ledger has 2 pages, he said, hands already smudging with the press residue. "If the city will accept a list, it will accept another. If we print enough copies, perhaps a doubt will spread that is large enough to shelter someone, or many. Or a doubt that will force them to tighten the screws," I said. I thought of my name again, and of the ledger's appointed date. "If they suspect a falsification, they will burn presses. They will make examples of printers. They will make me their example." Tien looked at me and then at the ledger. "Then we make a falsification that is not a trick, but a translation," he said. "We do not hide our hands. We make them look like the same hands that make the ledger. We use the same size of paper, the same ink, the same quill. We make it plausible because plausibility is what they trust. If the defense is that the ledger is an archive of orders, then the counterfeit will be read as part of the archive. The doubt will be in their records." The modesty of the scheme comforted me. We had, until then, been small ciphers in the ledger's margins. Tien proposed we make our cipher look institutional. The ingenuity had a kind of moral clarity to fight paper with paper. But Father Bino T was less sanguine. He worried about the moral arithmetic. "You cannot simply replace a name without the weight of guilt at your elbow," he said. "Forgery is a language of lies. Lies have histories, so do truths," I said. "Their histories are just better edited." He did not answer, and perhaps the silence was wiser than any speech. The ledger, after all, did not argue with theology. It argued with administrative habit. That night Tien worked until his shoulders ached. He and I sat then, in the press room with the lantern low, watching the slow alchemy of replication. He burned plates in a controlled way, learning to emphasize certain letters, to make the counterfeit breathe the same as the original. I held the paper to the light and watched the watermark ghost through, like a faint memory of truth. It is strange, and some might think perverse, that the act of forging can feel like devotion, a devotion to a different kind of truth. We did not pretend that our paper would be holy. We pretended only that an administrative ledger could be made to doubt its own voice. Outside, the city kept its uneasy cadence. At intervals my heart would catch at a distant sound, the drill of boots, a voice raised in a complaint, the chime of a bell calling some civic ritual. Each sound marked the passage of other people's appointments and made my own seem more counted. I slept badly, which is to say I did not sleep at all but lay instead with the ledger beneath my pillow, as if proximity might turn paper into pillow and thereby into protection. It did not. Instead, I found that the ledger made my dreams precise. I dreamed of the tribunal's steps, of a book being read aloud in a voice that did not belong to me, and of the name Mary falling like a stone. I woke with the taste of iron on my tongue and wondered at what time a public life becomes private property. In the morning I took a copy of the ledger and wrote, with a careful, unadorned hand, a small annotation in the margin. I had learned this trick from marginalia, to make notes that are small as insects and therefore overlooked. I wrote nothing dramatic. I wrote an instruction, a footnote for those who would look. See clerks' ledgers, collations of parish lists, notes of bribes, alignment with municipal registers. It was not much, it was a seed in a margin, but marginalia are not powerless. They are the worm in the apple, the small bit of reasoning that will, if eaten, change the flavor of the whole. Jean Morel came by that day with the same broad face and dull uniform he always wore. There is a way policemen come into a shop, as if to test whether ordinary commerce can continue despite politics. He paused at the counter and said, in his habitual slow voice, "I do not envy you your hours." There was a softness beneath the sentence that made me think of his soldiering, of what compromises men return with from fields. "You will like the ledger when it is about taxes," I said, producing a cup of weak tea, as if that could be the evening of conversation. He sat because he had nowhere pressing to be, and for a long while we traded small talk that had been stripped of its old energies. He was careful in his questions and I in my answers, but between our sips he gave me something the ledger never had, a staring sense that not all hands were the same. "There are men in the tribunal who do not like imprecision," he said quietly. "They have their order. But some of us know when a list is unfair. If anything goes wrong, if the ledger looks unstable, the men in the squares may not be the only ones to notice." It was not a promise. He could not, in a city like ours, promise much. He could not promise that his hesitancy would turn into action. But he offered another kind of detail, a misfiled report, a clerk who liked his ale, a small mercy. Acts like these, I had learned, are the hinge on which other acts turn. They do not look like heroism, but they are sometimes what stands between the ledgers of men and the lives they list. The ledger that contained my name did not, in the end, change the calendar by itself. It made me change mine. When one discovers oneself named in an instrument designed to decide destinies, one either becomes invisible or one becomes deliberate. I chose the latter. It is not a grand choice. It is a litany of small actions, to write marginalia that teach others how to read, to make a counterfeit that looks like honesty, to ask Father's archive for the history of clerks. I would not know then whether those actions would save me or send me sooner to the tribunal's steps. I only knew that remaining a passive reader of my fate would cost me the last thing I could still own, the deliberate voice. At dusk I sealed a small packet and tucked it in the false bottom of a trunk that had long carried sermons and receipts. Inside I placed a clean copy of the marginalia, a note for Tiny's hands, a list of names we could still protect, and a single blank line with my own hand beneath it, as if to say that my life could still be entered differently. I did not try to be brave, I tried only to be precise. When I locked the shop that night and drew the scarf over my hair, I walked past the window and saw, for the briefest time, my own reflection overlaid with the street. It looked like two images double exposed, the person I had been and the person I might become. The ledger that had named me lay in its hiding place, as if nothing had changed. And perhaps nothing had, but I felt in the small arithmetic of the body that a subscript had been added to my life. Names, it seems, can do more than identify. They can also instruct. And then, as the street grew darker and the lamps were lit like small witnesses, someone knocked at the back door. It was a single, deliberate knock, not the scattershot knocking of a customer trying the hours, but the slow, administrative rap of someone who always knew when to come. I paused with my hand on the latch and felt the ledger's ink as if it were a